A mutated spider terrorizing the residents of an apartment building in the Ukraine. Nuclear radiation that spawned a three-headed frog, and an ominous blackbird that seemed to signal the worst nuclear disaster in history. These are mutated animals found after nuclear fallout. So we've all heard of the wild stories about mutated animals in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but there's one story from the Ukraine about a mutated spider that you likely haven't heard of. The story goes that two residents of an apartment in the Ukraine were found in the elevator, having suffered extreme BLOOD loss. But the elevator was completely clean, aside from the dead bodies, of course, who both had puncture wounds on their necks. It was as if their bodily fluids had been sucked right out of them. Rumors started to spread in the building that a vampire was lurking around, and some residents were so scared they refused to use the elevator at all. Then two detectives decided to look into it. On the third day of their investigation, they hopped into the elevator, which suddenly stopped between the 5th and 6th floors. Now at first they weren't too worried, since the elevator was known to be pretty janky, but then they heard a weird clicking noise from above them. They pulled off a roof panel and shone their flashlights up, only to see a foot-long black shape scuttling toward them. Suddenly it lunged at one of the detectives. His partner fired at it, but it was too late. His partner was dead. When backup arrived, they found the surviving detective in a corner, terrified, with his dead partner and a massive mutated spider in front of him. When the police checked the elevator shaft, they discovered the thing had laid eggs. They burned them all with flamethrowers. People believe these monstrous spiders were a result of radiation from the Chernobyl disaster, which somehow mutated them into these deadly creatures. At least, so the story goes. Now we hear about animals with extra limbs or even two-headed animal mutations sometimes, but three-headed mutations, can't say I've ever heard that one before. And this one is absolutely real. No urban legend status to this. So in 2004, a three-headed frog was found in the garden of Green Umbrella Nursery in the UK, and it may have been the result of nuclear radiation. A student who had just been dropped off at the nursery found it. At first the staff thought it was just three frogs snuggled together, but then they looked closer and realized it was actually one frog, not just with 3 heads, but it also had 6 legs. The staff placed it in a tank, but by the next morning it had somehow escaped. Although I guess if you have 3 brains, you're probably better at figuring things out. A biology professor at the Open University called this mutation, quote, completely unheard of. He figured the mutation could be linked to parasites or pollution. There was a decommissioned nuclear power station nearby, so it's possible the frog was mutated by radiation. Moving back into the realm of urban legend for a moment though, let me tell you a story of the blackbird. In early April 1986, people living near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant started reporting a strange and terrifying creature, a large mutated bird with giant wings and bright red eyes. This creature, dubbed the Blackbird of Chernobyl, seemed to be connected to a series of eerie events. People started seeing the bird in their dreams, and sightings of the creature seemed to increase as the days passed, building up to the early hours of April 26, 1986, where at 1:23 a.m. reactor 4 of the Chernobyl plant exploded, followed by a fire and nuclear meltdown. The disaster released radioactive fallout, leading to the evacuation of over 336,000 people. After the explosion, Soviet helicopters were sent to fight the fires at the plant, and some of the firefighters who survived the initial blast later claimed to have seen an ominous creature gliding through the air, one that looked a lot like the one people had been reporting, a massive creature with a 20-foot wingspan flying through the radioactive smoke. After the disaster though, sightings of the Blackbird of Chernobyl stopped, and it left people wondering whether the creature was some sort of bad omen. Some also believe the Blackbird of Chernobyl could have been the same creature reported in Point Pleasant, West Virginia before the collapse of the Silver Bridge in 1968. Mothman. Speaking of Mothman, this creature is usually thought of as some sort of radioactive abomination. Reports of a strange winged creature began appearing in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 60s, culminating in the collapse of the Silver Bridge in December of 1968. Witnesses described the creature as having large wings, glowing red eyes, but with a human-like body shape. It became known as the Mothman. And much like the Blackbird of Chernobyl, some believe it appeared as a harbinger of doom. In the days leading up to the disaster, people reported seeing the Mothman flying near the bridge. But as soon as the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people, the Mothman sightings immediately stopped. Sound familiar? Over the years, people have wondered what this creature was, or if it really existed at all, of course. Was it just a misidentified animal? Could it have been a mutated creature of some kind? Or was it really some sort of paranormal being that shows up before major disasters, warning people of what's to come? A new attack atoll is a group of islands in the western Pacific where the US did 43 nuclear tests between 1948 and 1958, including the first hydrogen bomb test. All that testing left the lagoon, soil, and everything around it radioactive. In 1972, the US spent $100 million to clean up the mess. They mixed 80,000 cubic meters of contaminated soil with cement and filled it into a giant crater, then covered it with a huge concrete dome. But even after all that, the damage didn't just disappear. Turtles living in the area were found with radiation in their shells. During the cleanup, radioactive sediment from the lagoon got stirred up, and the turtles ended up swallowing it, which left them permanently affected by all that fallout. Yes, we had real-life radioactive turtles. That'd be a fun Ninja Turtles knockoff, Teenage Mutant surfing Ninja Turtles, because they're sea turtles.
We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the toxic river. There's a river that's just filled with radioactive water right near the reactor. The scariest part is, despite how toxic the water is, a bunch of aquatic life live there. In particular, giant catfish. Yes, giant catfish. A video from 2016 shows a massive catfish swimming in the water. People originally were like, oh my god, what the heck is that? It must be some sort of mutated animal. Later, it was just found out to be a giant catfish. But still, what the heck? And it's the fact that they have adapted to be able to survive in that highly toxic water. Like, that just baffles me. Not only that, but they can thrive there because the water has no higher predators. Obviously though, you're not allowed to go fishing there. Okay, I feel like that's a given, but I also feel like people would still try it, so I'm just gonna say it. Don't go fishing there. In our 4th spot, we have the jarfish. Speaking of fish, we're gonna go with this. So back in 2016, photographer and journalist Miriam Wazer took a trip to explore the ruins of Chernobyl. While inside an abandoned building, she came across something very creepy and odd. She found a bunch of fish and other specimens in jars. Why someone was collecting fish, it just baffles many. And they weren't even like proper beakers or science mason jars. No, it looked like someone emptied out their jar of pickles and then used it to store the specimen. I think it's best if those remain untouched. Like, can you imagine how stinky they would be if they were open nowadays? They would reek. Old stinky fish is not something I would ever want to handle. Now the other specimen beside the fish are unknown. No one knows what the heck they are. But if you know, let me know in the comments below. Coming in at number 3, we have the abandoned hospitals. The hospitals at Chernobyl are quite eerie. They're just filled with rusted, empty hospital beds, littered syringes, and more. The walls and floors are cracking, and there's dirt and questionable red marks on the floor. I think the saddest thing though is that these hospitals are often trashed with medical supplies just tossed everywhere. The days after the explosion happened, people were frantically rushing to hospitals. Hospital staff were overwhelmed by the amount of people there. This moment is still preserved in the hospitals to this day. It's pretty dark once you think about it. And at number 2 today, we have the Sad Alley. The Sad Alley, or the Alley of Memory, is an alley in the Ukraine created in memory of the villages and residents who had to flee from their homes during the disaster. Basically, it's a walkway with signs lining the sides. These signs are names of cities and villages that had to evacuate and leave everything behind. It's a way to ensure we just never forget the impact that this disaster had. It's really sad. Starting off this countdown, we have the sarcophagus. Basically, this is a massive steel and concrete structure that covers the Chernobyl power plant. It was designed to help contain the radiation. The construction of the structure lasted for 206 days, and those working on it had to work in shifts of no more than 7 minutes. Any more time spent near the reactors would have killed them. But still, they did sacrifice their lives building this because thousands of workers still died died from exposure to the radiation. Those that survived got severely ill, and majority of them developed cancer. Nowadays, the sarcophagus is still there, but it's beginning to crumble. In 2019, they were in the process of dismantling it because it was going to collapse. So a new one is currently being installed. That's probably the scariest thing in Chernobyl because of how deadly the building it's containing is. Coming in at number 9, we have the gas masks. And if you guys are liking this video or want to see part 3, then smash that like button. Chernobyl already looks like the place where an apocalypse occurred. Buildings are completely abandoned, run down, and overgrown with nature. What doesn't help is the piles upon piles of gas masks scattered all throughout Chernobyl. This really adds to the eeriness of this place. And again, makes it look like a place where a zombie or alien takeover occurred. In fact, there is one room inside a school which is just completely filled with child-sized gas masks. It's very creepy, but also sad. Like, imagine how frightened the young children were when this happened. The gas masks found there are just a sad reminder of the horrors that took place there when the reactor exploded. Moving on to number 8, we have the rotting toys. Littered all throughout the city are toys or personal belongings people had to leave behind. The saddest thing to see are pictures of children's toys left behind. Like, I just think that was probably someone's favorite little dolly. Go anywhere there and you'll find items scattered everywhere, now broken and covered in filth. Like, imagine you're rushed out of your home and have to leave behind all your personal belongings. That must have been so hard. I can't imagine how everyone must have felt. It's really depressing to think about. Moving on at number 7, we have the examination chair. So this one is pretty strange, but somehow a gynecologist's examination chair ended up in the middle of the woods outside of a hospital. Not only is that super weird, but it's also super creepy. It's all rusted and beat up and looks like an old torture device. Not only that, but that means someone had to go inside the abandoned hospital, find that chair, and then carry it all the way back down and into the woods. I got a lot of questions. Why would someone do this? And how long did it take them to do this? And again, why would someone do this? Either way, it makes for a very spooky encounter. Moving on at number 6, we have the abandoned cooling tower. A partially constructed cooling tower can be found at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They were built to evaporate the cooling water from the 2 new reactors. Sadly, they were never completed. Now, these things are massive. The diameter was over 120 meters and it stands at 150 meters tall. Obviously, after the accident, there was no need to continue on with the construction of this, so the government just left the towers there along with everything else. Eventually, over time, nature will have its way with it and it will start to erode and crumble. It's just crazy seeing all these abandoned infrastructures. Imagine how life would have been if that explosion never happened.
Now we have this gray mound of rock near Weldon Spring, Missouri. It doesn't look all that interesting, but the backstory is pretty nuts. During World War II, the site was used to produce explosives. Then in the 50s and 60s, uranium was enriched for nuclear weapons at the facility. The problem was, when the operation shut down in the late 60s, they didn't really clean up. There were piles of uranium and radium, TNT, and asbestos left behind. It was just this giant toxic mess. If someone were to fall into it, they'd end up like that dude in RoboCop. So to deal with it, the government decided to cover it all up. Not in a conspiratorial sense, I mean literally just cover it up. They built a giant hill to seal in all the radioactive waste and chemical debris. This mound is now called the Weldon Spring Site Remedial Action Project Disposal Cell, but locals have just nicknamed it the Nuclear Waste Adventure Trail. Today people can visit the site, climb to the top of the mound, and get a view of the surrounding area. There's really not much to see other than grass out in the distance, but I guess it's cool to stand on. The hill is used by birdwatchers as well and amateur astronomers who just like looking at the clear skies at night. I can't say that this would be my go-to spot on like a pleasant nature walk. I get that it's supposedly totally safe now, but I don't know, I still wouldn't want to spend too much time in a place like this. According to one former security guard though, they spent years working at the site without any major health problems. Still, it's a pretty weird spot for a tourist attraction. This is archival footage of a nuclear test being carried out at a site called Maralinga in Australia. The British government carried out a series of nuclear tests here Between 1956 and 1963, 7 nuclear explosives were detonated above ground, along with over 600 minor trials. These minor tests were anything but harmless, though. They involved experiments with plutonium, uranium, and other toxic stuff that spread contamination across the area. The fallout impacted not just the test site, but also nearby Aboriginal communities, many of whom were never properly warned or relocated. And the cleanup, which didn't start until decades later, has been heavily criticized. At one point, workers just bulldozed contaminated soil into pits and buried it. Some plutonium-contaminated areas were only partially cleaned and still are a risk today. Even after remediation, scientists have found radioactive particles spread far beyond the core test zones. Maralinga is technically open to visitors now, and some tours are available, but access is limited, which is a good thing. Long-term effects of the testing on the indigenous people here is still not addressed all that well, and the full health impact still isn't fully known. So it's isolated, but it's one of the most contaminated places in the southern hemisphere. Back in 1874, a story came out that lit up newspapers around the world. It was written by a guy named Edmund Spencer and featured a letter supposedly written by a German explorer named Karl Leech. According to this letter, Leich was deep in Madagascar when he came across a tribe called the Makotos, who, according to him, were not exactly the welcoming type. They quietly led him through the jungle until they reached a strange-looking tree, and that's where things got very dark. Leich described the thing like a giant pineapple with huge hooked leaves and a pool of liquid at its center. Then came the horror show. The Makotos forced one of their women to climb the tree. She drank from the liquid, and immediately the tendrils snapped to life and wrapped around her, crushing her like a snake. She screamed, then choked, and then the tree started oozing bodily fluids down its trunk. Leich claimed he stuck around and studied the tree for weeks, said he found smaller versions of it, said he even saw one eat a lemur. The Yativia was first written about in 1887 in Land and Sea by American journalist and author J.W. Buell. It's supposedly a real carnivorous tree found in South America, with relatives rumored to grow in Africa and along the Indian Ocean. Most descriptions say it has a short, thick trunk and long tendrils that lash out and grab anything that gets too close. Some versions even say it has an eye used to track its prey. Locals were terrified of it. They believed it was cursed, the result of some kind of dark magic or witchcraft. The way Buell described it, this thing didn't just eat bugs like a Venus flytrap, it was actually big enough to take down humans. The tendrils were covered in hooked barb, and instead of growing upward, they lay in a circle on the ground, like a trap. It sorta looked like a good place to rest, but if you got too close, the spines would spring up like snakes, coil around you, and crush you to death. In 2007, villagers in Padrama, South India claimed something insane was going on in the forest. A tree was eating their cows. Farmers had noticed cattle returning home without tails. Some of the cattle were just missing entirely. Then one afternoon, a cow grazing near the forest was suddenly yanked off the ground by what witnesses described as living branches. The animal screamed and thrashed as the herder ran back to the village in a panic, and a group of people returned with axes and machetes. By the time they got there, the tree still had the cow, but they managed to beat back the branches and rescue it. The tree, according to villagers, went limp after being struck. Locals call it Pili Mara, which means tiger tree. And they've had stories about it for years. Forest officials did acknowledge that reports had been made about cattle injuries and missing animals, and said their staff even came across a partially cut down tree in the same area, one that seemed to match the descriptions. A few years after the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, some strange photos started making the rounds online. They showed flowers, specifically daisies, growing in these weird, unnatural shapes. The petals were fused together and the stems looked thick, stretched and twisted like someone had mashed a bunch of flowers into one. It's a condition called fasciation, where the plant's growth hormones go haywire and cause it to grow in weird ways. These mutated daisies were found roughly 100 miles from the Fukushima site, and it didn't take long for people to blame radiation. After all, this was one of the worst nuclear disasters in recent memory. Moss Man is one of Florida's lesser-known but creepiest cryptids, described as a tall humanoid about 6 to 7.5 feet. Its entire body is covered in what looks like moss, almost looks like a walking ape-like bush. The first reported sighting was in 1978. A couple was relaxing on the beach when they spotted what looked like a man in a raincoat lying by the rocks. They ignored it until it stood up, and that's when they realized that it wasn't a coat. What they thought was fabric was actually moss, growing straight out of the thing's skin. It also had bright red eyes which locked onto them. The couple rightfully hopped to their feet and bolted. Later, the only thing left behind where the strange creature had been was a clump of Spanish moss. That kicked off a string of sightings over the next 2 years. People reported seeing its head rise from the ocean mist or spotted it drifting through the trees in parks. It was seen in places like Red Reef Park, Hillsborough Beach, and West Palm Beach. Closest call came in 1980. When an elderly couple saw something hidden in the bush during an evening stroll at Red Reef. Well, the woman leaned in, and the thing turned and locked eyes with her, and they were glowing red, staring right through her. The couple ran for it. There haven't been any major sightings since. Till this day, no one really knows what people were seeing. This one comes from deep in the Nicaraguan swamps, a plant known as the vampire vines, just as horrific as it sounds. The original story was published in Lucifer magazine back in 1891, from a report by a naturalist named Leroy Dunstan. He was out collecting bugs and plants when his dog suddenly started crying out nearby. He ran over and found the animal tangled in what looked like thin, rope-like vines. The plant's branches drooped like a weeping willow, but there was this black, sticky substance oozing from the stems. It was kind of like sap, but darker, almost like tar. He tried to cut the dog free, but as soon as he touched the vine, it turned on him. The tendrils seemed to reach out, trying to latch onto his skin, and wherever it touched, it burned. Blisters formed almost instantly. His dog managed to survive, but was covered in little bite marks. Dunstan later said that the locals called it Devil's Snare, and that others had actually been killed by it. He tried to take a piece of the vine home, but the thing died during the trip and it started rotting. It smelled so bad that he had to throw it overboard. Chernobyl's radioactive fallout didn't just poison the ground, it changed the way things grow. Inside the exclusion zone, where humans mostly stay out, researchers have been quietly planting and studying crops to see how radiation still affects life. One of the biggest surprises is wheat. The seeds looked normal, but what happened after planting was anything but. Scientists found that wheat grown inside the zone was mutating at a rate up to 6 times higher than normal wheat. Some plants sprouted weirdly fast, others barely grew. Some had odd shapes or stunted roots, others were completely sterile. These weren't caused by heavy doses of radiation like you'd get in an accident. This was from long-term, low-level exposure in the soil, the air, and the water. So the wheat's DNA got scrambled, not enough to kill it outright, but just enough to confuse the signals that tell it how to grow. What's even creepier is that these mutations are still happening, decades after the disaster. So even when things seem to look normal, nature is still having a very hard time recovering. In 1968, Jennings Frederick was out hunting in Fairmount, West Virginia when he heard a weird sound. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human either. It was this high-pitched, fast and jittery noise, almost like someone playing a tape at double speed. Curious, he tracked it through the woods until he came face to face with something he'd never forget, no matter how much he tried. It was some sort of creature. It had pale greenish skin, a skinny frame, arms like branches, and fingers tipped with thorns, and was making that awful, inhuman sound. All Jennings could do is stand there in complete shock and awe until suddenly he could hear the thing talking, not out loud, but in his head. "Don't be afraid. I want to talk. I come in peace. I need help," it said. And then, without warning, the creature rushed him, grabbing him in a tight, almost desperate hold, piercing his skin with its thorned fingers. Jennings tried to break free, but the thing just would not move. During the whole encounter, its eyes kept flashing in different colors too, and Jennings just couldn't look away. It felt hypnotic. But a few seconds later, the creature finally let go and sprinted up a hill. Not long after, Jennings heard a deep, low humming, like an engine firing up, and the creature was gone. It was never seen again. Next up, we have the cactus cat. Part cactus, part cat, cactus cat. It's Stories about the cactus cat go way back to the old frontier days. Cowboys swore they'd seen this odd plant-like cat creature in the deserts of California, New Mexico, Nevada, and parts of Colorado. They said it looked like a bobcat, but with cactus-like spikes instead of fur, sharp bones sticking out of its front legs, and a tail that split like a tree branch. The thing didn't hunt prey or stalk travelers, instead it had a strange obsession with cacti. It would come out at night, slice open cactus plants with its claws, let the sap drain out. And then the next night, it'd come back and drink the fermented liquid, basically cactus moonshine. That's when the thing would appear intoxicated, would stumble around and wail into the dark. People said its cry was eerie and sad. And its bones, it would make this dry, scratching noise when it moved. It wasn't usually aggressive toward people, but there were stories of folks waking up with scratches and welts like the creature had swatted them with its barbed tail. What you're looking at here is one of the most feared creatures in all of Japan, Korea, and possibly all of North America. This is the flying flesh carrot, because that's kind of what it looks like, somewhere between a carrot and a chunk of raw meat. It doesn't walk, it doesn't crawl, supposedly it floats, silently gliding through the air. Most sightings come from hikers or hunters, usually in remote areas, who catch a glimpse of it drifting by and then disappearing into the trees. One of the first reports popped up on a Japanese message board in 2019. A guy claimed that he saw this thing just hovering along, bright orange, kind of fleshy, not really flying in the usual sense, just sort of existing midair. Then someone else replied saying his sister caught something similar in a photo taken in Korea, but he said it looked less like a carrot and more like a blob of meat. But just what in the hell is this fleshy carrot horror? No one knows.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the loss of biodiversity. One of the most haunting aftermaths of the bombing was the eerie disappearance of entire species from the area. Sensitive animals and plants that couldn't withstand the radiation and environmental upheaval simply vanished. Imagine wandering through what was once a vibrant ecosystem only to find it eerily silent. No chirping birds, no rustling insects, just a void where life used to thrive. Predators lost their prey, plants lost their pollinators, and the intricate web of life began to unravel. The radiation didn't just harm individual creatures, it disrupted the harmony of nature itself. It's chilling to consider how one single event could erase so much natural diversity in the blink of an eye. What wonders and secrets of the natural world were lost forever in that instant? In our number 4 spot today, we are talking about the glass and metal fusion. One of the most surreal discoveries in Hiroshima was how the extreme heat from the blast melted glass and metal objects, fusing them into twisted, otherworldly shapes. Imagine a ceramic bottle warped and melded into a metal fence, or window panes liquefied and draped over charred remnants of furniture. The temperatures soared so high, over 3,000 degrees Celsius, near the epicenter, that solid materials behaved like molten lava. These fused artifacts weren't just random debris, they became haunting symbols of the sheer destructive power unleashed that day. Scientists have studied these distorted objects to understand the incredible temperatures reached during the explosion and how such intense heat affected everything in its path. It is very eerie to think that everyday items like coins, bottles, and even bicycles were instantaneously transformed into grotesque sculptures of devastation. In our number 3 spot today, we are talking about the shadows. Perhaps the most haunting remnants left behind were the eerie nuclear shadows etched onto surfaces throughout the city. When the bomb detonated, the intense flash of heat and light bleached everything it touched, except where objects or people blocked the rays. This resulted in ghostly outlines of humans and objects permanently imprinted on walls, steps, and sidewalks. Imagine seeing the silhouette of a person sitting on a staircase, their form forever captured in a moment of daily life turned tragic. These shadows are stark reminders of the individuals who were vaporized in an instant, leaving only their imprints behind. They provide a very
visceral connection to the exact moment of the blast, showcasing the devastating immediacy of the explosion's impact. It is both fascinating and deeply unsettling to stand before these imprints, knowing that they mark the final moments of lives abruptly ended. In our number 2 spot today, we have the unidentified victims. During the massive reconstruction of Hiroshima, workers often stumbled upon human remains hidden beneath layers of rubble and ash. Many of these remains were unidentifiable, their identities erased by the intense heat and destruction. Imagine uncovering a skeleton clutching a melted trinket, or fragments of bones mingled with debris, each one silently testifying to a life once lived. These discoveries were haunting, but also deeply significant. For some families, they provided a semblance of closure after years of uncertainty about the fate of their loved ones. From a historical perspective, these findings enriched our understanding of the tragedy's human toll. Perhaps even more heart-wrenching were the personal belongings found alongside the remains, intimate glimpses into the lives frozen in time. Watches stopped precisely at 8:15 a.m., the exact moment the bomb detonated, their hands forever marking the instant where everything changed. Scorched clothing fragments, like a shoe or a tattered school uniform, told stories of innocence lost. Other items, a pair of glasses twisted by heat, a lunchbox charred yet still holding a meal prepared that morning, became poignant symbols of everyday routines abruptly shattered. These artifacts transformed into powerful reminders of the individual lives behind the staggering statistics. It is fascinating and deeply moving to hold these objects, realizing that they were once a part of someone's daily life, now serving as silent witness to a moment of unimaginable horror. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we are talking about the health effects. Right after the bombing, many suffered from acute radiation sickness. They experienced horrific symptoms like severe burns, hair falling out in clumps, relentless vomiting, and bleeding gums. But the nightmare didn't stop there. In the years that followed, there was a shocking spike in leukemia and other cancers among them. Studies uncovered that the intense radiation had wreaked havoc on their DNA, leading to genetic mutations. These weren't just personal afflictions, some of these mutations were passed down to their children and even grandchildren, resulting in birth defects and hereditary conditions that rippled through generations. On top of all of this, the psychological trauma was immense. Survivors grappled with PTSD, haunted by flashbacks of the blinding light, the deafening explosion, and the harrowing scenes of destruction and loss. Depression and anxiety became common shadows in their lives. It is just extremely chilling to think how a single moment on that fateful day unleashed a cascade of physical and emotional suffering that would echo through the decades. In our number 9 spot today, we are talking about black rain. Just when the survivors of Hiroshima thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse, the sky unleashed a haunting black rain. This wasn't just any ordinary rainfall, it was a toxic brew of radioactive soot and ash from the atomic explosion. People who had escaped the initial blast found themselves drenched in this ominous downpour, unknowingly inhaling and ingesting radioactive particles. The black rain didn't just poison those in the immediate vicinity, it spread contamination far beyond the blast zone, reaching areas that thought they were safe. Countless people developed radiation sickness, mysterious illnesses surfaced, and the haunting effects lingered for generations. It is very eerie to think that something as natural and life-giving as rain could become a silent messenger of widespread devastation. In our number 8 spot today, we are talking about the deformed plants. After the bombing of Hiroshima, the devastation wasn't limited to buildings and human lives. The very fabric of nature seemed to unravel in disturbing ways. Imagine strolling through fields where sunflowers didn't just grow, they loomed monstrously oversized with stems that split and forked unpredictably. Their leaves were twisted and deformed, resembling something out of a surreal nightmare. Morning glories, usually delicate and beautiful, bloomed with petals so misshapen that they were almost unrecognizable. Scientists were completely baffled by these mutations, plants exhibiting abnormal growth patterns, gigantism, and bizarre deformities. These The intense radiation had infiltrated the soil, scrambling the DNA of flora and leading to these unsettling changes. It was as if nature itself was protesting, displaying the invisible scars of nuclear fallout in an extremely haunting way. In our number 7 spot today, we are talking about the mutated animals. One of the most unsettling discoveries in Hiroshima after the bombing was the bizarre mutations seen in the local wildlife. Picture rabbits born without ears, birds with twisted beaks or missing feet, and butterflies sporting oddly shaped wings or unusual color patterns. Many insects, birds, and small mammals exhibited physical abnormalities like malformed limbs and albinism. The radiation definitely didn't discriminate, it seeped into every corner of the environment, altering the DNA of creatures great and small. Even their reproductive systems were affected, leading to dwindling animal populations as they struggled to produce healthy offspring. It's chilling to think about how the silent forests and fields around Hiroshima became a living laboratory of genetic mutations, all stemming from that single devastating blast. Who would have thought that the ripple effects of human conflict could reach so deeply into the natural world? In our number 6 spot today, we are talking about the radioactive isotopes. One of the most disturbing aftershocks of the bombing was how radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 stealthily crept into the food chain. Plants absorbed these radioactive particles from the contaminated soil, turning everyday crops into dangerous carriers of radiation. Herbivores like cows and rabbits ate these plants, unknowingly accumulating toxins in their bodies. Predators and even humans then consumed these animals, further concentrating the radiation. Imagine families sitting down to what they thought was a wholesome meal, not realizing each bite was a dose of invisible poison. The bioaccumulation led to long-term ecological chaos and serious health issues, including cancers and genetic mutations, affecting not just one generation, but many to come. It's very chilling to think that the very food meant to nourish communities became a threat, weaving radiation into the fabric of life itself.
The Hanford site in Washington was at one time a secret plutonium factory for nuclear bombs. It's still one of the most radioactive places in the US, but it's also home to deer, turkeys, wild hogs, and rabbits that scientists have been studying. Researchers found rabbits foraging near contaminated soil with high levels of cesium-137, a dangerous radioactive isotope that sticks around for decades. The Department of Energy and wildlife biologists monitor these animals because they can carry radioactive particles outside the site. Rabbits eat plants growing in contaminated areas and then move around the site, and sometimes beyond. Other animals can show traces of radiation too, but the rabbits consistently show the highest levels. So they're super valuable when it comes to understanding how far the contamination might spread.
The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster is another infamous example of how the cons of nuclear energy can sometimes far outweigh the good. The disaster took place in 2011 after a tsunami triggered by a massive earthquake crashed into the plant and damaged the cooling and venting systems, which resulted in the meltdown of not 1 or 2, but 3 massive nuclear reactors, which subsequently led to a massive amount of radioactive materials being released into the surrounding areas. Today, the reactors are still underwater, and unfortunately, they haven't stopped leaking radiation either. A combination that makes shutting down those reactors an incredibly difficult and dangerous task. Even robots sent in to assess the situation don't last long, about 1 hour, due to the excessive radiation levels inside of the plant. Right now, all Japanese officials can do is contain the leak as best they can, which at the moment consists of contaminated water collection and storage. It is estimated that it will take around $50 million and many years to actually shut down and decommission all of the reactors. So for now, all we can do is hope. And of course, we can also stay as far away from the Fukushima exclusion zone as is humanly possible, because as I said, the leak is ongoing. A 20-kilometer exclusion zone was put into effect on April 19th of 2011, just 1 month after the
the meltdown. All residents were evacuated and all unaffected reactors were decommissioned and eventually shut down the following year. But of course, by then the damage had already been done. A study done on wildlife in the area showed that 28% of pale grass butterflies suffered from deformities that altered their wing patterns and caused them to have malformed antennae and legs. Monkeys in the area also had significantly lower red and white blood cell counts than other monkeys in Japan, and fishermen in the area now have a minor cancer risk increase due to the increased radiation levels of Pacific bluefin tuna. Now, despite all of the negativity surrounding the Fukushima disaster, there are 3 species that have actually begun to thrive as a result of the disaster: mushrooms, spiders, and boars. Funguses in the area that contain melanin were able to convert the gamma radiation into energy, allowing them to spread much more quickly and efficiently. The number of spiders in the area also greatly increased. Another reason to stay away. This is likely due to the fact that the radiation caused their prey to become slower, weaker, and much easier to catch. And then of course there is the boar population. With no humans around to hunt them, in just 5 years the wild boar population jumped from 3 to 13,000. The only problem is boars eat a lot of food, and they also aren't shy. In the years since the disaster, wild boars have caused $900,000 worth of damage to surrounding farmland. Prior to the meltdown, the boar population was controlled by hunting, but seeing as their meat is now considered to be radioactive, even the ones born after the disaster, because of the plants they eat, the drive to hunt them has significantly decreased. There is now a culling in progress, which is basically like a paid killing of the animals, but because of the boar's levels of radioactivity, processing their bodies has proven to be incredibly difficult, costly, and time-consuming. It's an ongoing effort. Of course, nuclear meltdowns are not the only times in which nuclear cleanup has been necessary. There is also the case of nuclear warfare. In 1945, 2 nuclear weapons were used against Japan during the Second World War. On August 6, atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, making it the first ever nuclear weapon used in warfare, and on August 9th, Fat Man, the second and hopefully final nuclear weapon used in warfare, was dropped on Nagasaki. When the first bomb dropped, Hiroshima was hit with an estimated 15,000 tons of TNT, which completely destroyed 5 square miles of the city and directly killed around 70,000 individuals. In the years that immediately followed, injuries and radiation sickness raised that death toll to over 100,000. And in the years after that, cancer and other long-term radiation effects caused the number of indirect deaths due to the attack to rise even further. Those born in the area in the years that followed as well also had extremely high levels of radiation and were often born with birth defects that included cleft palates, cleft lips, clubbed feet, additional fingers or toes, and fused fingers or toes. Eventually the radiation subsided and Hiroshima was rebuilt, but not without a significant amount of money, time, and manpower. And then there's Nagasaki. Believe it or not, Nagasaki was not actually the original target for the second nuclear weapon. It was more of a last-minute decision. That's right, Fat Boy was actually supposed to have been dropped on Kohura, but due to weather conditions, the plan was changed, and as a result, Nagasaki was hit with a nuclear plutonium bomb that weighed nearly 10,000 pounds and that produced a 22 kiloton blast. About 30% of the city was wiped out within moments, and 60 to 80,000 deaths occurred as a result of both direct exposure to the blast and the long-term negative side effects of radiation. Those born in the areas surrounding the explosion site in the years that followed also experienced birth defects similar to those experienced in the areas surrounding Hiroshima. It took the city 2 years and a lot of money to begin to heal from the incident, but today the radiation levels of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki are on par with the low levels of background radiation found pretty much anywhere on Earth. The cities have reopened, and due to morbid curiosity tourism, they have become an incredibly popular travel destination. Well, while nuclear energy is obviously incredibly high risk, it's also high reward. It releases the least amount of greenhouse gases, it is consistent and controllable energy, it does not require raw materials, it's almost completely recyclable, and it does not emit any fine particles like nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrates, or phosphates into the air. On the flip side, sometimes some pretty bad stuff happens. For example, the Chernobyl disaster, which took place in the city of Pripyat in Ukraine on April 26th of 1986. That day, a misguided experiment in the nuclear facility, which at the time was one of the largest nuclear power plants in the world, caused a sudden power surge, which caused the 1,000-ton steel top to blow right off the reactor, which caused a lethal cloud of radioactive nuclear material to engulf the area before moving on to affect other parts of Europe. 32 people died that day in Pripyat, and while the exact number is unknown, it is estimated that as many as 70,000 people died as a result of the meltdown, and many others suffered from severe radiation burns. Surprisingly, despite this, the Chernobyl power plant wasn't officially closed until 14 years later in 2000. But of course, there is much more to a nuclear disaster than just death. When a nuclear disaster takes place, there are a number of things you have to do in order to contain the damage and keep the death toll from spiraling out of control. First, the leaking reactors must be stabilized via a cold shutdown, a process that cools nuclear fuel to a temperature of 100 degrees Celsius or below to keep the energy from leaking into the air. An exclusion zone then has to be created, restricted areas people are forbidden from entering for their own safety due to the high levels of radiation. Then there is deep geological disposal, which is storing low-level waste underwater for 5 years before moving it to dry storage. This disposal would also include 4 centimeters of all now radioactive topsoil from farms in the area. And then of course there is the research aspect. When a nuclear disaster takes place, it is super important to study their effects so that we can be better informed and better prepared in the case of any other future events. After the Chernobyl disaster, scientists noticed some negative effects in the affected areas, but also some good ones too. Starting off with the bad, pine needles on pine trees within a 1.5-mile radius of the meltdown turned red, and new trees growing in the area grew to look like mangled bushes that lacked central stems. As for the animals, the brains of 48 bird species were tested, and it was discovered that due to radiation causing oxidative stress, they had actually become 5% smaller, which led to a decrease in the birds' cognitive abilities. But their brains were not the only problem. Many birds also had malformed beaks and deformed feathers, making hunting and survival significantly more difficult than before. Oh, and deer meat became highly regulated after the incident because a lot of it was incredibly radioactive. But as I said, it wasn't all bad. Strangely enough, there were a few people who decided not to leave when the city of Pripyat was evacuated. Even stranger, studies showed that those who stayed actually had an increase in life expectancy in comparison to the national average. Why? We do not know. We literally don't know. Like the city of Pripyat, the nearby Kopachi village was also evacuated. Unlike Pripyat, it was then bulldozed and buried. That's right. After the incident, officials declared the village highly radioactive, unsalvageable, and a major health risk. And so it was determined that the village would be buried to keep the radiation levels from the Chernobyl meltdown down and to protect those living in the surrounding areas. Unfortunately, that was kind of a big mistake. You see, when the village was bulldozed and then buried, it became much easier for radioactive chemicals to seep into the local underground water table, which led to the village becoming contaminated for much longer than it would have been had they left it alone. Today, Kopachi village is completely covered with grass, and the only remnants are building markers that mark where each building would have once stood, and of course, a whole bunch of radioactive warning signs.
Meanwhile, in Norway, the fallout from Chernobyl affected reindeer. The radioactive elements settled in the soil and were absorbed by moss and fungi, which reindeer love to eat. And after the fallout, reindeer were found to have radiation levels of over 100,000 becquerels per kilogram, way higher than what's safe. Though the radiation in reindeer meat has decreased over time, sometimes levels still spike, going above 2,000, still enough to cause concern for those who eat reindeer meat. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, macaque monkeys living near the plant were found to have dangerously high levels of radiation in their bodies. The earthquake and tsunami triggered a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear plant, releasing radioactive cesium into the environment. Macaques' diet, which includes mushrooms, tree bark, and bamboo, likely contributed to this exposure. Again, these plants absorb radiation from the soil, and as the monkeys ate them, the radiation accumulated in their bodies. In fact, the macaques were found to have up to 13,500 becquerels of cesium per kilogram. Scientists believe the radiation might have also caused some disturbing effects on the monkeys as well, like smaller heads, smaller brains, delayed growth in general, and even anemia. After the Chernobyl disaster, nature took over in a big way. The area around the reactor, especially the ghost town of Pripyat, has seen this massive explosion of plant life, with humans gone, for the most part anyway. Trees, vines, and bushes have crept over everything, turning the place into this sort of urban jungle. It's actually pretty amazing how quickly nature rebounded. This regrowth has created new habitats for all sorts of animals, and the area is now home to all these thriving animal populations. But it's not all good news. Some scientists noticed that certain parts of the forests aren't decomposing as they should. Leaves in areas with higher radiation levels didn't break down properly. In an experiment, leaves from cleaner areas were left in spots with more radiation, and after nearly a year, those leaves had only decomposed about 40%. Instead of breaking down, they just stayed dry and intact. That might not seem like a big deal, but when dry leaves pile up in a place that could be prone to a forest fire, that's a bit of a hazard risk. If a fire were to break out, it could also spread radioactive material well beyond the exclusion zone. Back in 2014, something pretty wild happened on a farm in northeast Croatia. Zoran Paparic's goat, Sarka, gave birth to a kid with 8 legs, along with 2 healthy goats. Sarka had this extra-legged baby, which also had both male and female reproductive organs. Local vets said it was likely because of an underdeveloped twin sibling that didn't fully form. When Zoran first saw the goat, he couldn't believe his eyes, saying, "I counted his legs and I thought I was seeing things." Then I called my neighbor to make sure that I wasn't crazy. People started calling it the octo-goat. Zoran hoped the little guy would survive, and even though vets weren't too optimistic, they said it probably wouldn't make it, but if it did, it could live a couple of years. I don't know what's happened to this goat now, but yeah, pretty nuts. This is footage taken in what's called a radon health mine. So this is a place where people pay to inhale radioactive gas for health reasons. The one you're looking at here happens to be in Germany, but Montana is really the place to go if you want to try this out for yourself, which I wouldn't do, but some swear by it. So in Montana, there are a handful of abandoned uranium mines that have been repurposed into these radon health mines. These mines naturally emit radon gas, which is radioactive and is said to increase your risk of cancer. But for decades, some people have believed that short-term exposure can actually help with conditions like arthritis, asthma, and just chronic pain. So instead of avoiding it, visitors pay to spend hours underground sitting in folding chairs just breathing it in. It's not backed by any major medical organizations, and the long-term effects here are questionable at best. Radon is a known carcinogen, and the Environmental Protection Agency lists it as the second leading cause of lung cancer in the US. Gotta say, this has to be one of the strangest uses of a radioactive site. This was the Baker Event nuclear test conducted at Bikini Atoll on July 25th of 1946. Bikini Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, was used by the United States as a nuclear testing site after World War II. Between 1946 and 1958, the US detonated 23 nuclear weapons here, including some of the most powerful ever tested. The most infamous was Castle Bravo in 1954, which ended up being more than twice as powerful as expected and spread radioactive fallout across a much wider area than they'd planned. Nearby islanders weren't given proper warning and were exposed to high levels of radiation. Some were relocated, but the long-term effects were pretty bad, mainly increased cancer rates and, again, birth defects. To this day, the area is uninhabitable. Some former residents have been allowed some short visits, but nobody actually lives here full time. Oddly though, they tried to promote Bikini as a great place to dive. To be fair, the lagoon is filled with shipwrecks from World War II, but that's because it was a fleet used as nuclear target practice. Yeah, I don't know if this would be the first place on my list of diving destinations. This is Lop Nur in Xinjiang, China. It's a dried up lake bed also known as the Sea of Death. For decades, this was China's main nuclear testing site. Starting in the 60s all the way up to 1996, They ran 45 nuclear tests out here. They dropped explosives from planes, they did underground detonations, and blew up hydrogen bombs. It's super remote, which made it ideal for military use, but that didn't mean people weren't being affected. Some of the blasts released huge clouds of radioactive dust, and to this day, no one really knows the full impact on people or the environment. After the last test in 1996, the site went quiet. Until recently, in late 2023, satellite images showed some new construction popping up. Roads, fences, some buildings. Some think China's getting ready to start testing again, which the government has, of course, denied. This right here is what's known as one of the most radioactive areas of Chernobyl. That's saying a lot. After the explosion in 1986, a lot of the melted core material ended up pooling underneath the plant. One of the most dangerous things left behind is what's now known as the elephant's foot, this giant solid mass of radioactive goo made up of melted nuclear fuel, metal, sand, and concrete. It got the name because of the way it looks, like a huge wrinkled lump. It kind of looks like elephant skin. At the time it formed, it was extremely radioactive. Just standing near it for a few minutes back then would have killed you. Photos were taken by bouncing cameras off mirrors so that no one had to get too close. The surface was so hot that it was physically burning through the floors. These days it's cooled down a lot, and it's not instantly lethal anymore, but it's still dangerously radioactive, and it's locked away deep inside the ruins of the plant. This is footage of one of the reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant exploding. So on March 11th, 2011, there was a massive 9.0 earthquake off the coast of Japan. This caused a giant tsunami which hit the power plant. The plant was designed to shut down automatically during emergencies like earthquakes, but the tsunami flooded the backup generators, which were supposed to keep the reactors cool. And with no power, the cooling system failed, and over the next few hours, the reactors started to overheat. The pressure built up, and 3 of the reactors went into full meltdown. Hydrogen gas built up inside the reactors, and eventually it exploded, sending radioactive material into the air. The fallout spread to nearby towns, and thousands had to evacuate. The ocean got contaminated as well, and on top of that, there were more nuclear emergencies, including a radioactive leak into a wastewater storage pool. Cleanup is still happening. It could take more than 40 years to fully decommission the plant. While the reactors have been shut down, the area around Fukushima is still heavily contaminated. Large parts are still off limits. This is footage of workers cleaning up radioactive sludge from the K East Basin. The K East Basin was a large pool at the Hanford site in Washington, D.C. It stored used nuclear fuel from a reactor called the N reactor. It was built in the 50s close to the Columbia River, which made it risky if anything leaked. Well, over time, the fuel started to break down, creating a thick radioactive sludge at the bottom of the pool. The basin became heavily contaminated, and it was getting concerning, so the US Department of Energy decided that it needed to be cleaned up. Workers removed the fuel and sludge over the course of years. Once the cleanup was done, they drained the water and filled the basin with grout to prevent anything left inside from spreading. These workers were vacuuming about 55 cubic yards of radioactive ooze. They stood on grates suspended above the 20-foot deep basin and used vacuuming equipment at the end of long poles. You'll notice there are also shots from the underwater cameras that they used to help guide their work. Off the coast of Greece, there was this story about a pale, mutated, misshapen dolphin. So this photo here was snapped by a man named Harvey Robertson, a Scottish tourist on a boat cruise. It does look pretty damn strange. I mean, if someone in a lab coat showed me this image and said it was a radioactive dolphin, I'd probably believe them. The image first surfaced on cryptid forums where fishermen and beachgoers came forward saying they'd seen it near the Ionian Sea areas, rumored to contain dumped cruise ship waste. Zoologist Dr. Darren Naish from the University of Southampton's National Oceanography Center thinks that if someone took a skin sample from this thing, though, it would probably show a lot of polyvinyl chloride, basically plastic. So yeah, he doesn't really think this creature is real, but What do you think? After the 2011 meltdown at Fukushima, scientists and members of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, have been testing fish in the plant's inner harbor, and they've come to some shocking results. Well, maybe not all that shocking considering what happened, but still interesting. In May 2022, they caught a black rockfish that was full of cesium-137, 180 times Japan's safe limit. Over a year-long period, they found 44 fish above the limit, caught inside or near the same port areas. These contaminated fish are almost all bottom dwellers that feed off the sediment where radioactive cesium has settled. The sediment was found to have over 100,000 becquerels per kilogram of radioactivity. To put that into perspective, Japan's safety limit for radioactive cesium in food is just 100 becquerels per kilogram. This stuff was literally 1,000 times over the safe limit, so way too dangerous for human exposure, obviously. TEPCO has installed nets to stop this radiated seafood from mixing with safer catch, but even then, a fish caught about 50 kilometers away in January of 2022 was still above the limit, so bottom line is, cleanup hasn't eliminated all radiation in the food chain.